Looks like we may be live now. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome, Mr. Chair Gazone. I'll let you kick us off. I know we have David Romans and his team, but no opening
Nope,
remarks from my side.
mine either. Just happy to have everybody here. Mr. Romans,
No,
please.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we do every year, we're going to present you our fiscal briefing, which is going to give you an overview of the budget covering, the general fund, revenues in the economy, transportation trust fund, capital, personnel, and some other topics. I think it's being shared on the screen now. Um, just a general comment. I think this budget is a lot less complex than last year, likely less controversial than last year, but it does accomplish the spending affordability committee goals that were set. So it does make some progress. It improves the structural outlook, certainly for fiscal 27 and 28 as well. However, it does not make substantial progress for fiscal 28 and beyond. So we still face very substantial and challenging shortfalls in the out years that will likely be left to the next term to try to resolve. With that said, on this first slide, you can see at the top, the total fund budget is about $70.7 billion. It's about a 500 million increase over the governor's plan for fiscal 26. The fiscal 26 plan, it should be noted, includes $3 billion of deficiency appropriation. So money being added in fiscal 26 to cover both bills that will be incurred in fiscal 26 as well as leftover bills from fiscal 25. The state didn't have enough funding available in the agency accounts to pay for. General funds and federal funds actually decline when you compare the 26 plan to the 27 plan. Part of that is because there's money in the 26 plan to pay prior year bills, so sort of one-time costs. Special funds go up almost $1 billion because of growth in transportation spending, growth in blueprint spending, and some variety of other sources. Some key points about the budget. There's a general fund balance of 108 million left at the end of fiscal 27. There's $2.2 billion in the rainy day fund. That's about 8% general fund revenues. And the structural gap is reduced from the 1.2 billion that was projected back in December to about 394 million for fiscal 27. So substantial progress there. Again, all three of those areas meet the spending affordability committee goal. Can we go to page 2, please? Okay, so what this chart is looking at is what are the governor's proposals that require legislative action? So without this list, you would be 1.4 billion short of balance. The governor is 1.5 billion of actions that will bring you into balance and get you to that 108 million surplus at the end of fiscal 27. We've broken them into 3 categories. The revenue categories, the biggest is local income tax reserve account. There was an over allocation from the state to that account at the end of fiscal 25. This is correcting for that over allocation. The maybe most notable issues are decoupling from provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. There's about between the second item and fourth item in that revenue list is about $133 million of general fund revenues from decoupling from 2 of the provisions. So I'll discuss later on. There are other provisions the governor is not proposing to decouple from. All of that will be for the General Assembly to decide during the session. The other thing under revenues is there are various land and open space programs that are being funded with bonds, general obligation bonds, rather than cash in fiscal 27. So that allowed for the transfer tax revenues to be diverted to the general fund to the tune of 72 million. Under transfers is nearly 600 million of transfers. The biggest is 259 million from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, which has a substantial balance because we've seen a surge in CEF revenues over the last couple of years. The other large item there is the Fiscal Responsibility Fund. This is a fund that received some money at the end of fiscal 25. We had a big surplus at the end of fiscal 25. Part of it was due to unusually high capital gains revenues. A portion of those were deposited into the Fiscal Responsibility Fund. And the intent by statute was that they be used to fund capital this session. Governors instead using them to help balance the budget. Under spending reductions, again, there's almost 600 million of actions there. Most of the amount is covered by the rainy day fund. The governor's proposing no appropriation to the rainy day fund by statute. it's required to put 450 million, which is much of the surplus from fiscal 25, into the fund. He would instead let it be used to help balance the fiscal 27 budget. And as I said, we still have 2.2 billion in the rainy day fund without this appropriation. There's a couple of other notable reductions. Local retirement costs for teachers, librarians, and community colleges. The locals for the second year in a row are being asked to cover half of the state's increase in costs. The costs would normally be paid from the state, so it's about 39 million when you combine the teachers, librarians, and community colleges that locals will be being asked to pick up that they would not have been expecting. The disparity grant is level funded at the fiscal 26 formula level. That saves the state $27 million. It has a particular impact on Prince George's County, which would have gotten about 17.5 million of that 27 million, and on Allegheny County, which would have received about 6 million of that 27 million. Community colleges, the formula is being capped at the school level. No school is allowed to get more than a 3% increase under the formula this year. So overall formula funding grows by 11 million, but it would have grown by 32 million if not for this provision. There are many other BRF items. They're not all summarized here, but those were the major ones. Let's go to the next slide. All right, this looks at the general fund budget outlook on a structural basis. So ongoing revenues versus ongoing spending. The bars are under the governor's proposal. The dotted line was the DLS forecast from back in December. Obviously, it did not account for the cost containment and other things in the governor's plan. So as I said earlier, you can see in fiscal 27, substantial progress going from a projected 1.2 billion down to about 400 million. Fiscal 28 is about 400 million better than was being forecast in December. The further out years are similar to what was forecasted back in December. And as you can see, are a substantial magnitude, reaching $4 billion by 2031. So substantial challenge in the coming years. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so back in December, we were projecting a cash deficit for the general fund of $1.6 billion. So we're trying, the next few slides are going to look at, well, how did the governor resolve that? Well, 3/4 of the solution is shown in the pie is spending reductions. And we're going to focus on that on the next slide. So these blue bars represent what, if you surprises, if you will, compared to what was in the DLS forecast back in December. So these are deviations that were not expected. The going left to right, the biggest deviation is the BRF items in terms of spending reductions that we already discussed. The second biggest area is the governor was able to find federal funds and special funds to swap for general funds to about 345 million of those swaps. So avoiding any difficult reductions. There's a couple of items I do really want to highlight. The third item from the left, Medicaid behavioral health costs. It's about 170 million less than we forecasted back in December. There is not any major cost containment that explains that. So it basically is the administration has a more favorable to the state forecast. So we're a little concerned that there's some underfunding there, but we will be taking a deeper dive when we get to the behavioral health analysis into whether there's adequate funding for behavioral health. A couple of lines further along on the chart, there's 150 million reduction related to the Developmental Disabilities Administration. This is all cost containment actions that are being proposed by the governor. Many are quite similar to actions that were proposed and rejected last session. One last reduction area I would highlight for you is there are no provider rate increases for health and human services providers in this budget. We assumed back in December 2% increases, and this providing no increase saves about $86 million for the general fund. There are some areas in the budget, however, that they're higher than we were forecasting. The judiciary has requested more money than we assumed. Employee health insurance costs are growing rapidly. Overall, employee health insurance expenses are up about 9% in the estimates for fiscal 27. This is kind of consistent with what we've seen nationally in terms of health insurance costs and Medicaid costs rising rapidly the last couple of years. And then there's a number of initiatives and enhancements that we'll talk about on the next slide. All right, so this is kind of a preliminary list. Obviously, as we go through the agency budgets with a fine-tooth comb, we'll identify other things. Um, I'll notice a couple of the bigger ones. There's an adjustment to the employee pay scale um, to basically increase the longevity salary increases that employees would get. It costs about 42 million. This is on top of a employee COLA of 1.5% that we had anticipated in our baseline forecast that there would be a COLA. So that's not why that's not here as well. Legislative priorities. So for the first time, since the General Assembly has had the ability to add, the governor has actually set aside money in the budget for your priorities in the operating budget. So $30 million for that purpose. There's $30 million for emergency facility maintenance at public safety facilities. There's nearly 29 million of unexpected money for school assessment costs, which we saw a similar trend last year. Maybe something that committees want to focus in on a little bit as to why those costs keep rising rapidly. And then there's a number of various grant programs. IonQ gets additional funds for their new headquarters. They received 10 million last year for this purpose. There's an additional 16 million being put into the Sunny Day Fund, which is used for business attraction and closing costs. 16 million was put in last session as well and has not yet been used. The Enough Act gets about a $15 million increase. And many of you may have seen back in November, I think it was, the governor announced that AstraZeneca would be expanding an existing facility in Frederick and building a new facility in Gaithersburg, and that the state would provide 8 years of financial support at nearly 15 million a year. So this is the first installment of that. One other item I will note, Allegheny County received a deficiency appropriation for infrastructure repairs from storm damage and flooding that they experienced last year, and that FEMA rejected the request for federal support to help with. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so we get into some other key features in the budget. I wanted to highlight for a minute the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, because as I mentioned, there's been a big surge in revenues to that fund in the last couple of years, and there was a substantial surplus. So the governor is proposing to use that in a variety of ways. He uses 333 million, as you can see in the chart, for budget relief. 292 million is transferred to the general fund. 30 million is used for capital projects that have a sort of CEF-related purpose. And then there's some fund swaps where CEF is being used to support operating costs in various agencies that are CEF adjacent in terms of their purposes. Then there's also a number of new investments totaling about 400 million. We have a chart later on that gets into a lot of details. I just want to mention the two big ones there. Last session, the General Assembly provided 200 million to provide some ratepayer relief. This budget proposes 100 million of ratepayer relief in fiscal 27. There's also a proposal for financial incentives, including tax credits, for solar and clean energy projects. And apparently this is to help backfill cuts to federal subsidies that have been taken over the last year. One last one I will mention is there in the dedicated purpose account, there's 42 million of CEF money for higher education research on energy, resiliency and climate. We understand that this will go to the research centers in the state, including about 25 million for the university system, 8.5 for Morgan State University, and 8.5 for Johns Hopkins University. One last thing, the bullet under the CEF chart that I want to talk about on this page is K through 12 education. It grows almost 360 million, 3.7%. This includes 228 million. There was a discretionary decision of the governor. He's essentially holding harmless community eligibility schools who, because of a change in state law that went into effect for fiscal 27, would have seen a significant reduction in the number of students qualifying as free and reduced priced meals. By continuing what was essentially a hold harmless for those schools, the governor spends an additional 228 million on compensatory education and concentration of poverty grants. Let's go to the next slide. And I think I'm going to skip right over this because we're going to cover all of this in much more detail later on. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so this slide just has some key issues for the session in terms of for the fiscal committees. The first is obviously we continue to have that long-term structural challenge. The second is there's this looming uncertainty about what else might the federal government do, both in terms of further job cuts as well as any further cuts to state funding and grants to states. So that's going to be a concern, and we'll certainly be paying attention in March when the Board of Revenue Estimates revises its forecast to see if there's any more downward estimates in their revenue estimates. Another big issue for the session is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act's business tax provisions and whether the state will choose to decouple permanently. In addition to the items that the governor proposed decoupling from, there's about 120 million of state revenue that could be realized by decoupling from two other provisions, one related to research and experimental expenditures, and the other the treatment of business interest expenses. I mentioned the adequacy of the behavioral health budget is a concern. In the transportation area, we're a little concerned that the legislative audits in its fiscal 25 closeout audit identified $1.4 billion of costs that MDOT has charged in prior years to the federal government, but that they weren't able to convince legislative audits that they were going to actually receive that funding. While it's likely that a substantial portion of that money will eventually be recouped from the federal government, there's certainly a risk that it will not all be recouped and that could be a significant hit to the Transportation Trust Fund balance. Last thing I'll just mention is this kind of looming. It's probably not something you're going to have to deal with this session, but the Child Victims Act remains out there. There's been about 12,000 claims against the state with a maximum liability on each of those of $890,000. Does not appear to be a resolution to that coming anytime soon, but at some point in the future, the state's going to have to figure out a way to make some sort of settlement payments or pay any sort of rulings from the courts come down with. So on top of the structural budget outlook, that's another sort of long-term challenge to the state budget. Go to the next slide. The last thing I want to talk about is the Blueprint Fund. You've all seen this chart before. It shows you how we're paying for the implementation of the Blueprint for K-12 education. The blue bars show you the ongoing Blueprint revenues that they get each year and how they support the program. They supported a substantial portion of the cost in fiscal 25 and will again in 26 and 27. But they're relatively static and flat, so they're not going to grow to cover the ongoing implementation expenses. Fund balance in the Blueprint Fund, which was built up when we were in good financial times, is the green part of the bars. And we've been using that to help supplement the ongoing Blueprint revenues. And it's been adequate to fund all of the Blueprint implementation costs through the fiscal 27 budget. It's hard to see there was about 131 million available to pay in fiscal 28. But then as you can see in fiscal 28, the Blueprint fund balance is exhausted and something else has to supplement the ongoing Blueprint revenues. And our forecast and the administration's forecast assume that the general fund will pick up the rest of those costs. And you can see that would be a 1.7 billion in fiscal 28, up to 3.3 billion by 2031. And that obviously is a big contributor to that stress you saw on the structural chart earlier on. Mr. Chairman, that really concludes my kind of overview remarks. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa Chizinski, who's going to talk to you about the economy and revenues.
Good afternoon. We're going to take a little brief detour here from the budget to talk about the economy and the revenues. The first table here on page 11 is simply an overview of the economic performance in 2025. We don't quite have data for the entire year yet. The first couple columns all deal with the labor market. The unemployment rate in November was 4.2%. There's no data for October 2025. That's because of the federal government shutdown. This data comes from a survey that was not conducted in October because of the shutdown. So there will forever be a gap in the data series because of that. We will get December data tomorrow. But the 4.2% is up from 3% at the beginning of the year. It's the highest unemployment rate Maryland has seen since October of 2021. We do rank 20th in the nation in terms of the unemployment rate, with number one being the highest. The number one is the District of Columbia, which is at 6.5% unemployment rate. The next column relates to the initial claims for unemployment insurance. This is what we refer to as the regular state program. It covers the private sector as well as state and local government employees. There was a jump in the month of October during the government shutdown. Obviously, a lot of private contractors work for the federal government, and they were also not working during that month. So you can see a jump there. But overall, for the year as a whole, total initial claims for unemployment insurance were basically flat with 2024, which indicates there were not a significant number of private sector layoffs in 2025. The next column is continuing claims. These are people who are collecting unemployment insurance from week to week. And that did go up over the course of the year. It's up about 13.4% from where it was in 2024. So that does kind of indicate that even though there haven't been a large increase in layoffs, people who are losing their jobs are staying on unemployment insurance longer. The next column is the federal program. There is a separate program for federal government employees in terms of unemployment insurance. And that's shown in the fourth column over. That did also spike in the month of October during the shutdown, but then it did come down. It is up substantially, however, from 2024. I will say that for the people who took that federal deferred resignation program, those people who signed up for that were stayed on the federal payroll through the month of September. They would not be eligible for unemployment insurance benefits because they voluntarily left their job, and you have to really be laid off to qualify for unemployment insurance. And the last couple columns, there's one column about the vehicle market, and then the last two columns deal with the residential real estate market. If we go to the next slide, and we'll focus on the federal government employment situation, just to set the stage, in 2024, there were about 162,000 federal civilian jobs in Maryland, with another 193,000 jobs each in the District of Columbia and Virginia. And obviously, there's a lot of commuting between those three jurisdictions. The little table here shows you what has happened to federal employment in 2025. Again, we don't have December yet. We'll get that tomorrow. But between January and November of 2025, Maryland lost about 25,000 federal jobs. We're down 15.3%. That's the largest percentage decline among the states. Virginia and the district actually also lost a similar amount of jobs. So the three states combined have lost 72,000 jobs since January and account for about 26% of the total nationwide decline of 279,000 jobs. Now, this data in November does reflect those federal employees who took that deferred resignation. They came off the federal payroll at the end of September. And interestingly, between September and November, federal jobs declined by 10,300, largely reflecting that group coming off the federal payroll. And that number is consistent. The BRE was expecting this to happen. They did not have this data at the time of the December forecast, but they were anticipating something on that magnitude in terms of additional federal job loss, and that was factored into their December income tax forecast. Interestingly, the three states combined lost about 37,000 jobs between September and November. So a little over half of the total job loss actually happens after those deferred resignation people came off the payroll between September and November. So it was a very significant impact on total federal employment. We go to the next slide, and we'll continue to look at the labor market, but take a little broader view and bring in the private sector as well as state and local government. This is the same kind of deal. We're talking about November versus January. There was some growth in state and local government employment, but in total, government jobs are down 3% over this time period. The private sector is down 3,200 jobs, or 0.1%. In this comparison, Maryland ranks 46th among the states in the District of Columbia. The district, not surprisingly, ranks last. They're down 1.2% in terms of private sector employment. There's growth in a few industries. Healthcare, which is a very large industry, is up, as is private education services, leisure and hospitality, which are restaurants, bars, hotels, those sort of kind of services, and construction. Pretty much everything else is down, either slightly or just, or maybe more substantially, like there's a pretty sizable drop in transportation, warehousing, and utilities, for example. This week, job growth, it's not unique to Maryland or even to the DC metro area. In terms of the United States as a whole, private sector employment was only up 0.5% over this time period, with the total up 0.3%. That's very low private sector job growth outside of a recessionary period. So it's not just about Maryland or even the federal government impact on Maryland. It's clearly more broad-based than that. And of course, the first place we would expect to see a weak labor market would be in withholding for personal income tax revenues. For all of calendar 2025, so January through December, withholding is up 4.3%. And that is down substantially from 6.2% growth in calendar 2024. So if we move on to the next chart and head towards revenues, we're going to start looking backwards at the fiscal 2025 closeout. Sounds like a long time ago, but of course it does feed into the budget, the overattainment there of a total of $521 million. Revenues grew 3.4% over 2024. If we exclude one-time items, the growth was 4.1%. The largest source of overattainment was the personal income tax. That strong growth in withholding in 2024 resulted in an overattainment in withholding, although the growth in fiscal 25 withholding was kind of bifurcated. The first half of the year grew 8.9%. The second half of fiscal 25, which would have been the first half of calendar 25, grew 4.7%. So there was a real slowdown over the course of the fiscal year. But the other big driver of the personal income tax was final payments with returns, which was up substantially, largely driven likely by strong growth in non-wage income, including things like capital gains. We did see underattainment in the corporate income tax for the first time in many years. Total net receipts were down 0.4% versus an estimate of 2.2% growth. In terms of the general fund, it's important to keep in mind that the share going to the Transportation Trust Fund did increase between fiscal 24 and 25, going from 20% to 21%. The sales tax was over the estimate by $72 million and grew almost twice as fast as expected. There seemed to be substantial growth in durable goods spending, especially in the early part of calendar 25, as people were going out and buying goods in anticipation of tariffs. Cannabis revenues were up 12.6%, but they did underattain. They were under the estimate by $15 million. And there was also a change in the share going to the Blueprint. The Blueprint share was 11% in fiscal 24, and it went up to 11.3% in 25. There was a decline in tobacco tax revenues. They fell 8.7%. Part of that is due to a new distribution to the Blueprint Fund. It was $88 million in fiscal 25. That was the first year of money going from the tobacco tax to the Blueprint. And there were substantial overattainments in a number of places: the business franchise tax, insurance and premium tax, and the estate and inheritance tax. But it was really that other category is driven by a substantial overattainment in unclaimed properties, which was over $200 million, well above the historical average of about $100 to $125 million. And on the next page, the last revenue chart relates to the general fund forecast. This chart compares the BRE's December forecast to their previous forecast, which came out in September. In total, the revenue change was fairly small, $91 million in fiscal 2026 and $9 million in fiscal 2027. This is largely about aligning the revenue estimate with year-to-date performance. The BRE's expectations about the economy are largely unchanged, although there was an upward revision to their capital gains assumption given the strong growth in the stock market in calendar 2025. The personal income tax was up about $79 million in fiscal 26 and $110 million in fiscal 27. This is again driven somewhat by that change to their capital gains assumption, but it's also driven by some technical changes. The BRE forecasts both state and local income tax together, and then they have to split them between the state and the locals. And there were some technical changes about how they did that split that added money to the general fund. Both the sales tax and the corporate income tax were written down. This, again, is largely due to year-to-date performance. There was a substantial upward revision to the estate and inheritance taxes, which have been very strong this fiscal year, and interest earnings. Although the BRE upped their interest earning estimate in fiscal 26, they did not carry that through to fiscal 27. They left actually their interest earnings assumption alone in fiscal 27 in terms of the estate inheritance tax. They only carried forward a portion because that revenue source is quite erratic, and you really don't necessarily want to count on it year after year after year. And then in terms of the lottery, there was a small upward revision of $11 million in fiscal 26. This is not really due to performance. It was really more about a technical change related to some of the special fund distributions getting revised. And if you're interested in the full list of lottery special fund distributions, they are in Appendix 6 on page 50. And that concludes the section on the economy and the revenues.
This begins the discussion of the fiscal 27 budget, beginning with a look at the deficiency appropriations. The total fiscal 2026 deficiency appropriations across all funds total about $3 billion. 59% of those, are about 1.78 billion, are related to the provider reimbursements across the Department of Health. The largest of those is Medicaid at about $765 million. There's also about 25% of the deficiencies that are related to prior year costs, totaling about $758 million. 718 of those, 718 million of that is also related to the provider reimbursements. There's about $121 million related to personnel across the state, including just a variety of salary and fringe benefit shortfalls, but it also includes some specific deficiency appropriations related to overtime expenses across the Department of Health, as well as turnover in the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. There's about $49 million of federal fund deficiencies to support higher child care scholarship. Turning to the next slide. This looks specifically at the general fund deficiency appropriations, which, as was mentioned, total about $966 million, accounting for planned reversions. About 34% of those relate to prior year costs. The largest general fund deficiency appropriations, about $362 million, are related to DDA provider reimbursements, and that's pretty evenly split between prior year costs and fiscal 2026 shortfall. The Behavioral Health Administration has about $147 million of deficiency appropriations. There are some prior year shortfalls in there, but it is more heavily weighted towards the current year shortfalls. And there's about $157 million for Medicaid. Again, a little bit more of those are related to current year shortfalls, but there are significant prior year shortfalls as well. There's about $41 million related to facility repairs. The largest of that is the emergency facility maintenance at the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. The Department of Human Services has about $41 million of general fund deficiencies. The largest component of that, about $28 million, relates to the SNAP payment error rate penalties for federal fiscal 2023 and 2024. Turning to the next slide, this looks at the general fund, or the growth in the budget between years, which are the lines, and the bars represent the share of the agency's budgets of various sources, the general funds being the yellow bars. As you can see, in general, growth is pretty modest in most areas of the budget. Looking at the judiciary, that budget grows by about 8.4%. They have 51 new positions, and they've also assumed increases for judges, anticipating the recommendations of the Judicial Compensation Commission, as well as other salary increases that they have assumed. The largest decrease is in the area of human services. This is driven by a couple main factors. There's about $72 million of one-time support that was provided to the food banks and to help pay for SNAP benefits during the government shutdown. And the other main driver is the transfer of the Maryland Benefits Platform and the eligibility enrollment system from oversight in the Department of Human Services to the Department of Information Technology, which is also a contributing factor in the growth of about 9.6% in other executive agencies. Other factors that lead to the growth in that area, that is the place where the salary adjustments that were mentioned earlier appear in the budget, as well as the additional spending for the Maryland Energy Administration through some of the CEF funding. If we turn to the next slide, this looks at the general fund change in the budget. As was mentioned, general funds decrease by about $154 million, but when you exclude the prior year costs, it increases by $168 million. The largest area of growth is state agency costs. There are some growth in the local aid, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later in the presentation. If we turn to the next slide, this looks at the growth in general funds for state agencies, which is about $133 million, as I mentioned. Salary adjustments are the largest area of growth. That includes both the COLA for state employees, as well as the increment for SLEOLA employees and the change in the step width, as well as health insurance costs, which increased by $88 million. There's about $54 million of growth related to the OBA cost. There's $43 million is the largest component of that in the Department of Human Services, representing what they anticipate as the cost of the change and the SNAP administrative match rate, which the state will be responsible beginning October 1, 2026 for 75% of the cost compared to 50% historically. These increases are partially offset by a number of other changes, including mandates that expire, some general funds that are no longer needed in the Division of Paid Leave due to the implementation of the family program, and about $119 million to a variety of one-time costs, including the SNAP payment error rate penalties that I mentioned, as well as some other penalties and paying some federal audit disallowances. If you turn to the next slide. So this takes a look a little bit more at the CEF revenue and uses. This slide here is looking at kind of why there is so much more funding available and why it can be used in a variety of different ways, including to support the balance. So this looks at the two primary sources of revenue into the CEF. The first is looking at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative auction revenue. And the second looks at the alternative compliance payment revenue. That's on a calendar year basis. So both of them have seen substantial increases over the last few years, particularly the alternative compliance payments has really accelerated, even from a couple years ago which was already a lot more than had been received in many years. So the revenues continue to grow in that area. The calendar 2024 figures were about $362.3 million. The budget assumes a relatively similar amount in 2026 and 2027, a little bit lower than that. The RGGI revenue has kind of gone on a more steady increase since fiscal 2021. But does continue to grow. Only 2 of the 4 auctions have been held year to date, and the revenue we've received in those first 2 auctions puts us pretty much on pace for what was received in fiscal 2025. Turning to the next slide. This provides some additional detail on the uses of the CEF balances and revenue that's expected to be received, which ultimately are expected to bring the balance down to about $164 million combined. So there's about $88 million that are kind of expanded uses but are allowable under existing law. That includes expanding funding for community and multifamily vehicle charging infrastructure, supporting energy efficiency programs for low and moderate income households, both through MEA and the Department of Housing and Community Development. Continuing to fund some higher education and capital projects with some C funds for activities that are allowable under RGGI funding. And it also makes a change to provide a substantial portion of funding to the power plant research program in the Department of Natural Resources, as well as continuing to fund the Climate Catalytic Capital Fund, which would have expired, the mandate expired in fiscal 2026. There's about $328 million of expanded uses, including those that Dave mentioned earlier related to the rate credits. Most of these expanded uses are included as are part of provisions in the BRFA. The rate relief is not. My understanding is it's in separate legislation. The largest of these have already been discussed. There are a few other items, including funds to implement chapters 7 and 9 of the 2025 special session, $20 million in DGS funded through the ACP to support clean energy on state properties, as well as some funding related to grid enhancing technologies and establishing processes for co-locating transmission lines along state highways. The last few items on the list comprise some of the items that are providing some budget relief to the state. And then there are about $292 million of transfers. And the next page just shows that how this kind of brings down the balances of the two primary sources down to combine to about $164 million at the end of fiscal 2027. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. Oh, no, it doesn't. I'm sorry. The BRFA. So we've already talked about the major revenue and transfers. So just looking ahead to the some of the contingent general fund reductions. Again, you've already heard about some of the largest components of these. I'm just going to highlight a few additional ones. There's a provision that alters the uses of the cigarette restitution funds that are in the separate account that are dedicated for use for the HBCU settlement funds. For fiscal 2027 only, the provision would allow the amounts that are above $35 million to be used for other purposes, kind of spread throughout the Maryland Department of Health, but there's 8.4 million general fund reduction that would replace funds in Medicaid. The HBCU settlement funds are fully funded with a combination of the CRF support of 35 million as well as general funds to make up the remainder of them. Turning to the next page, this just kind of continues the list of the contingent general fund reductions, making a variety of changes to reduce mandates, expanding the allowable uses of special funds, and other changes to relieve the general fund of costs. They total about $593 million in total. Turning to the next slide, this looks at some of the special and federal fund changes, just to highlight a few of the special fund reductions, in addition to the transfer of the transfer tax funds, the next largest reduction reduces the mandate for the consortium for coordinated community sports from 100 million to 80 million. This is more than was provided in the fiscal 2026 budget, however. Turning to the next slide. This looks at a few other provisions that don't have a direct kind of contingent reduction or fiscal component identified, but they do produce savings or make other changes to allow funds to be fully utilized. The first of these that I'm going to highlight, legislation was enacted a couple of years ago to require assisted outpatient treatment programs in each jurisdiction. Jurisdictions had a choice about whether to operate the program themselves, or if they didn't, then the Department of Health would operate the program in the jurisdiction. They had to make that decision by last year. No jurisdictions chose to do so. So this provision requires that beginning in fiscal 2028, the local jurisdictions would contribute to the cost of that, and by 2031, they would be paying the full cost of those programs. It also, there's another provision that alters the participation targets in the Department of Service and Civic Innovation for the service year programs. And another authorizes rather than requires the Department of Health to apply for the implementation grant for the certified community behavioral health clinics, and changes the date by which that would happen. The change in the date is because they are still in the undertaking the planning activities. There is funding in the dedicated purpose account to fund to begin some of the pilot programs. And that concludes my portion of the presentation.
As you can see on page 28, it shows the level of state funding provided to local governments by entity. You can see that state aid will total around $11.9 billion in FY27. This represents a $370.5 million or 3.2% increase over the prior year. Page 29 shows the level of state funding by major programs. You can see that funding for public schools is up by $359 million, which represents a 3.7% increase from the prior year. Funding for community colleges is up by $13 million, which represents a 2.6% increase from the prior year. Funding for local health grants is level funded at the fiscal 2026 amount of $115.2 million. This includes $83.1 million in formula aid, an additional $32 million to support salary enhancements for local health department employees from both the current year and in prior years. At the county and municipal level, transportation aid will actually decrease by $6.3 million. This represents the completion of a one-time grant of $6.6 million that was provided last year to enhance pedestrian and bicycle access to the Ramada Purple Line stations. Other transportation grants, such as highway user revenues, will only increase slightly this year by around $200,000. As stated earlier, dispirited grant funding will decrease by $17.1 million. This is due to a BRFA provision that caps each jurisdiction's annual funding to the amount of the formula amount in the prior year. This proposed reduction will have a significant fiscal impact on several low-wealth counties that we will talk about later in the presentation. When you look at the other grants, that basically includes increases to two programs, to the voting system grants and a new $8 million grant to Baltimore City for their new dispatch system. If you turn to page 30, it shows the annual increase in state aid over a 10-year period. And as you can see, the 3.2% increase in 2027 is kind of at the midpoint of the increases in past years. Page 31 shows the level of state aid in FY27 on a per capita basis and on an annual percent change by jurisdiction. And finally, we're going to turn to page 32, where it shows you the proposed changes in state funding in FY27. We're going to start with community colleges. There you can see that there's a $21 million reduction in funding over current law, and this is due to limiting the increase in annual funding under the CADE formula for each institution to 3%. Funding for county governments will be reduced by around $27.2 million, and this is mostly due to the decrease in the disparity grant funding. The statutory formula amount for FY27 is set at $204 million compared to $177 million in FY26. Two jurisdictions are heavily affected by this, and that's Allegheny County, which will realize a $6.3 million in funding decreases, and Prince George's County, which will face a $17.5 million decrease. If we now look at funding for public schools will actually go up by $228.4 million, and that's due to a revised approach in counting the free and reduced price meal count. This new approach will impact funding under the compensatory aid, the concentration of poverty grants, and the education effort adjustment. State funding for compensatory aid and the concentration of poverty is partly based on the number of students approved for free and reduced price meals. Until fiscal 2027, the free and reduced price meal count included a hold harmless provision for local school systems participating in the federal community eligibility provision, or SEEP. The governor proposes to extend this hold harmless provision for fiscal 2027. This proposal will increase the number of students under the free and reduced price meals count by around 34,000, as shown on the following page. On the next page. Okay, here you can see that instead of a 9.4% decrease in the number of free and reduced price meal students compared to the fiscal 2026 funding level, the decrease will be limited to 1.7%. The additional students, as you can see, mostly attend three local school systems: Baltimore City, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County. And this concludes the state aid section of the presentation.
For the record, my name is Jacob Cash. I'll be discussing state personnel. So if you join me on page 35, on page 34, this table shows the position allowance by department. Many agencies are stable from fiscal 26 to 27, and the executive branch on the whole, excluding higher education, increases by about 200 positions. And over half of that is for the Department of Transportation Purple Line enforcement, as they increase operations. Maryland Department of Health also sees a decrease in positions due to vacancy abolishments, whereas other state departments see increases for a variety of reasons, and you'll be hearing about those in the individual analysis hearings. I'll also point out MD Think was transferred from Department of Human Services to Department of Information Technology, causing a change there. But the executive branch total, excluding higher education, is now 52,103 positions as of the fiscal 27 allowance. That's about an increase of a little bit less than half a percentage point. On page 35, this chart shows the trend in filled positions over the past year. So this time last year, the state had 46,156 filled positions in the executive branch, again, excluding higher education. State employment increased throughout the remainder of fiscal 2025, and that's mostly because separations were trending unusually low during that period. In order to meet the agreed upon fiscal 2026 budget, the governor announced a partial hiring freeze and a voluntary separation program in July 2025. The governor was able to abolish 171 vacant positions to generate current year savings, and also buy out 320 employees from employment to generate future cost savings. The results of those efforts did show promise. In October, you can see the number of filled positions declined and the vacancy rate increased to 10%. However, in the last quarter of calendar 2025, state employment increased again and vacancy rate decreased. So there's now a 9.4% vacancy rate as of the fiscal 2026 budget in January. As Tanya mentioned, there was a little bit over $100 million in deficiencies to agencies to replace salary funds that were cut. And I'll be moving to the dollar portion on page 36. So this table shows the position budget for each department compared to their January vacancy rate. As a whole, executive branch agencies are now within the budget for fiscal 2027. So there's 7.4% vacancy rate compared to 10% budgeted turnover for executive branch agencies, excluding transportation. When budgeted turnover is higher than vacancies, DLS typically interprets that to mean there's excess funds, but I would caution, I would express caution here. This analysis is for total funds currently. We haven't done the general fund only analysis. And the actual cost of each position has an impact on how much vacancy savings are generated from each position remaining vacant. So this is a preliminary analysis at this point, and we would urge caution, especially considering the deficiencies in fiscal 26. And finally, on page 37, this graph shows historical salary increases for state employees and the budgeted enhancements in 27. In 27, state employees are receiving a 1.5% salary increase, excluding Maryland School for the Deaf employees, who are receiving 2%, and law enforcement officers who are not receiving a salary increase, but are instead receiving a step increase. So the total value of those step increases is about 0.7% of the overall budget of payroll. So that is why we've included that in this chart here. Hard to recruit classifications are also receiving a grade increase in fiscal 2027, resuming the annual salary review process. And salary steps, as Dave mentioned at the beginning, are being bumped up systematically to create 2% increases between each step. So that reduces compression in the lower ranges, increases retention incentives, and is a part of the overall compensation enhancement package this year. That concludes my portion of the presentation, though, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you have at the end.
All right, good afternoon. The transportation section of the presentation starts on page 38. This first chart is showing a comparison of MDOT's most recent financial forecast for the Transportation Trust Fund to the forecast from 2 years ago, from January 2024, which was issued prior to the revenue increases to the TTF that were enacted in the 2024 and 2025 sessions. And this chart is basically showing the major increases in projected revenues and expenditures over the 6-year forecast period to try to illustrate what some of the changes associated with those increased TTF revenues were that were enacted in the past 2 sessions. There is an appendix at the end of the document, appendix number 17, which shows a breakout of the revenue projections for the increased TTF revenues for reference there. This first blue bar on the left side of the chart on page 38, in total, those revenue increases across the 24 and 25 sessions are estimated to grow TTF revenues by about $4.9 billion through fiscal year 2031. And then related to those increases, the January 26 forecast shows about $1.2 billion in additional bond proceeds from the sale of consolidated transportation bonds. That increase is somewhat related to those other revenue increases, because the other revenue increases grow MDOT's bond capacity and ability to issue an additional debt. So MDOT is projecting additional debt issuances throughout the forecast period. Then looking at areas of changes in expenditures, I'm going to start on the right side of this chart with the biggest area of increased spending in the operating expenditures. Compared to the 2024 forecast, the 2026 forecast shows about $3.1 billion in increased operating expenses over the forecast period. So if you can see, this is basically about half of the roughly $6 billion in increased revenue shown by the blue bars on the left-hand side of the chart. This is really continuing a trend that we've seen over the past couple of years, pretty much ever since the pandemic, of MDOT having pretty noticeable operating expense growth due to inflation and other various operating expenses. Capital spending grows by about $1.3 billion. Then we have a couple of smaller miscellaneous changes. There's about a $645 million decrease in revenues as a result of MDOT increasing the amount of its revenues going towards its fund balance. If you recall, the Spending Affordability Committee in December recommended that MDOT increase the closing balance of the TTF to $550 million. At the conclusion of fiscal 25, the balance was about $327 million. So by increasing that closing balance in future years, MDOT is putting more of its revenues towards the fund balance rather than having those available for expenditures. There's about a $600 million projected decrease in the motor fuel tax over the forecast period. This is something that's been talked about in recent years and is one of the desires for increasing other TTF revenue sources to offset some of that motor fuel tax decline. And then the last item is debt service costs grow by about $300 million to support that projected increase in debt issuance. We can move to the next slide, page 39. So this is providing a year-over-year comparison of the January 26 financial forecast to last session's forecast from January 2025. So there's some similar trends here. Motor fuel taxes over the 6-year forecast period declined by about $279 million. The largest increase in revenues, vehicle titling taxes grow by about $1.2 billion. This is due to some of the revenue increases last session. And due to the increase in titling taxes and the projected decrease in motor fuel taxes, for the first time in the 2026 forecast, titling taxes actually surpass motor fuel taxes to become the largest state-sourced revenue source for the TTF. Then there's a couple other large increases related to some of the revenue increases passed last session. The capital gains surcharge, which a portion of that is allocated to the TTF, results in about a $704 million increase. There's a little over $1 billion in miscellaneous motor vehicle fees from some of the revenue increases. And then there's about a $1.1 billion increase in bond proceeds due to increased issuances, as I mentioned earlier. Then under the expenditures section at the bottom of this page, debt service costs grow by about $241 million due to increased debt issuances. The operating budget grows by about $1.1 billion. Highway user revenue capital grants are decreasing by about $57 million. This is due to the out years of the forecast period. The statutory percentages for the distribution of highway user revenues were at a temporary increase level in fiscal 26 and 27, and then in 28 and future years, those percentages decrease back down to a lower percentage. And then the remainder of the capital program, there's about a $210 million increase in statewide funds going towards those expenditures. Then we can turn ahead. We can turn ahead to the next page, page 41. This chart is showing specifically for the capital side of things, MDOT's capital consolidated transportation program released in January shows about $22.1 billion in total capital spending over the 6-year forecast period, which is about a $900 million increase from the capital plan from last January. This chart is showing a breakdown of that by fund source. Special funds grow by about $154 million. Federal funds, MDOT is projecting about $890 million in additional federal funds. And this is really the majority of the reason for the overall growth in the capital program. And then there's some decreases under other funds. And then MDOT is projecting under the other funds category, the use of some grant anticipation revenue vehicle or GARVE funds for some of the MTA's projects. We can turn to the next slide on page 42. This is a breakdown of the CTP by MDOT mode, comparing 2025 plan to the 2026 plan. So the largest increase here is under the State Highway Administration. This is related to that $890 million federal fund increase, which I mentioned on the previous slide. MDOT is projecting that there'll be additional fund revenue attainment under SHA, which results in increased expenditures in the 2026 plan. And then there are some smaller changes in the other MDOT modes. The other largest change, the Maryland Port Administration decreases by about $163 million. This is largely due to the conclusion of the Howard Street Tunnel project, which comprises a large portion of the MPA capital program. That project is projected to wrap up in mid-calendar 2026. So there'll be a decrease in funding for MPA in future years. Similarly, there's some smaller decreases in the Maryland Aviation Administration due to the cash flow of some projects at BWI Airport. I mentioned earlier the changes related to highway user revenues, which result in the change under state aid. And then there's some other smaller miscellaneous changes in the other areas. That will conclude the capital program or the transportation section. We can move on to the capital program.
Good afternoon. Turning your attention to the capital budget, this chart shows an overview of the capital budget by fund source, and this includes $1.75 billion in new GO bonds in fiscal 2027, which meets the SAC limit. Academic revenue bonds increased from $30 million to $50 million, which is also consistent with the level recommended by SAC. $10 million of the increase goes toward offsetting planned GO bonds for the Health and Human Sciences Complex at College Park, while the other $10 million allows for the acceleration of costs for the electric substation project at Salisbury. You'll also notice there are no build-to-learn bonds in fiscal 2027. That's just due to the expected issuance schedule. Next slide, please. You heard in the earlier presentations that more than $300 million of operating relief was provided by shifting certain costs to bonds. So how did the governor make room for all that in the capital improvement program? The biggest factor is the postponement of the Baltimore Therapeutic Treatment Center project, which is pushed back to now start in fiscal 2028. That generated just over $230 million compared to the planned fiscal 2027 funding. And also the capital budget proposes deauthorizing a further $46 million that had been previously authorized for the project. Another $61 million was available due to delays in the new Supreme Court building project. $28 million comes from requests for the Community College Construction Grant Program, coming in lower than had been planned. And $21 million comes from strategic energy investment funds that are replacing planned bonds for higher education, facility renewal, and the comprehensive flood program. All of that together made the room to shift $167 million in WMATA funding to bonds and $135 million of environment and natural resources funding to bonds. And it also made room to provide $75 million for legislative initiatives. In addition, the governor funded nearly $60 million out of the $111 million that had been pre-authorized by the legislature last session. And the full accounting of those pre-authorizations can be found all the way at the end of your document in Appendix 21. I believe that concludes all of our presentations today, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Romans and team. Questions? Senator Solon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one question. I think David could answer it for me. Dave Romans. The responsibility, and I think they change for the blueprint further in the year. Do we have numbers on that for the state and local government between 27 and 31? 2027.
Yeah, we presented the state numbers. We'll have to get you the local numbers. I don't have the local contributions handy.
Okay. If you can get that, I'm sure we all would like to have that to see what that is. I appreciate it, David. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions? Senator Zucker.
Thank you very much. From the earlier, one of the earlier slides, it talked about the damage, I guess, that the Trump administration has caused on Marylanders losing federal jobs. My understanding, based on what was presented, is not only the loss of federal jobs, but it bled to the private sector for private sector job loss as well. Is that correct?
If Teresa's still here, I'll let her take the first crack at that.
Sorry. There certainly have been private sector job loss. We can't quantify that. You'll notice that the professional and business service sector is down 5,200 jobs. There are a fair number of private, private contractors for the federal government would be in that category. But we don't have a good way to get to a specific number, but there's no question that some of those budget cuts that have happened at the Health and Human Services Department, which is a very big employer, a big presence in the state, has fled through to other private sector and other things like outside of the professional business service would be an institution like Johns Hopkins, where they do have contracts with the federal government that may have also been impacted. So that's certainly true. We just there's no way for us to find private contractors in the employment data.
No question. Delegate Beauchamp. Delegate, you got your hand up, but then you've turned your camera off.
I apologize. I was trying to hit my mute button and missed it.
No problem.
Yeah, my first question is, it would be, or I actually have two questions. One of them is or both of them would be to David, and that is the majority of the local aid going to the schools? Is that what it looks like here? And the second question is, are the local governing bodies going to be in better shape than they were last year? Basically, the teachers' pensions coming down.
So on the first question, I think 85% of all local aid goes to public schools. So yeah, yes, overwhelmingly, and that's the area of almost all of the growth in local aid this year is in the public schools as we implement the blueprint fund. I think the magnitude of local impacts in this year's budget is smaller than last year. Last year, the teachers' retirement shift alone was close to 100 million. This year, it's close to 39 million. So I'm sure local governments will not be happy about that, but in terms of order of magnitude, I think they are smaller. But as I noted earlier, like the disparity grant has a very significant impact on a couple of counties. So there will be specific counties that may find this particularly burdensome.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Barnes, I don't see any further questions
I don't see anything either, Mr. Chairman.
or any other questions. I think we can adjourn the briefing and thank the department one more time.
Yep.
Very
Thank you,
thorough,
everyone. Have a
very,
great
very
day.
good.